Wel, prynhawn da, unwaith eto. I was last here on Friday of last week, the day the fire break period in Wales began, and now we are almost halfway through that period. The latest figures we have in Wales show just how serious a situation we face and just how necessary it was to introduce the fire break period. Today there are more than 220 cases of coronavirus for every 100,000 people living in Wales. And in Merthyr Tydfil, the 7-day incidence figure now exceeds 600 cases for every 100,000 people. Today, a further 1,700 cases of coronavirus will be confirmed, but we know that the actual incidence will be higher than that. And the number of people with coronavirus in hospitals in Wales is now back to the highest point since the end of April. The latest information from the NHS is that 1,191 beds are occupied by people with coronavirus symptoms. And that is more than 20% higher than just 1 week ago. Now, there were many times last summer when I was able to come here and report to you that we had gone through many days in a row with not a single death here in Wales from coronavirus. I cannot express the sorrow I feel at having to say to you today that more than 80 families this week alone are experiencing the pain, the grief and the loss that comes from a disease that we had not even heard about this time last year, taking their loved ones away from them. Now, this rapidly accelerating pattern that we see tells us how the virus was circulating in Wales up to 2 weeks ago, because it can take up to a fortnight for people to become ill with coronavirus. And what the pattern of transmission is telling us is just how quickly the virus has moved across Wales over the last few weeks. They tell us, as I said earlier, just how important and just how necessary this fire break period has been. Our hope has to be that the actions we are all taking will change the course of this disease, and in the weeks that follow the fire break, we will see its full impact. And of course, many people contact me asking about what Christmas will look like in Wales, and it's a special time for so many people. But that is why we have acted now, in October and November, so that we have the hope that in December we can have a Christmas with coronavirus brought back under control. Now, in the meantime, I repeat again that the fire break period will end on the 9th of November. Shops, bars and restaurants will reopen. Gyms will reopen. Students will go back to school. Churches and places of worship will resume services. Community centres will be available for small groups to meet safely indoors in the winter months. And working from home will become even more necessary, and we will strengthen the rules and the support to help make that happen. But most of all, I want to be clear again that when the fire break ends, coronavirus will still be here with us. And that even if just a small minority act as though that were not the case, then the risk is that the fire break period will fail and all the hard work of everybody else will be for nothing. So that is why the Cabinet has been meeting this week and has decided not to return to the network of local restrictions that we had in place earlier in the autumn. Instead, we will put in place a simpler set of national rules that are easier for everybody to understand, to help keep us safe and keep the virus under control. And we've been working hard this week to create this new set of measures that we can all live with this winter and that will give us maximum protection together with as much freedom as is feasible. And this is a difficult balancing act because this is a virus which thrives on close contact between people, especially contact indoors. And what this means is that at the heart of the new system, the system we will have in place after the 9th of November, that it will have to be at its heart the way in which every one of us go about our daily lives. If we are to keep coronavirus in check in Wales without resorting to the disruptive lockdowns and fire breaks, then we all need to adapt to the virus in the same way that businesses have adapted over the last 6 months. If the new measures are to work, we all have to act in ways that live up to the public health emergency we are facing together. Please do not treat the new rules as though they were a game in which the challenge is always to stretch them to the limit. Please don't make your first question, what can and what can't I do? Instead, we should all be asking ourselves, what should and what shouldn't I be doing to keep myself and my family safe? And the answer to that question is that we should all do everything we can to reduce the contacts we have with other people, at home, in work, or when we go out. Government rules and regulations are there to help, but the real strength we have is in the choices we make and the actions we take together. Over this weekend, the Cabinet here in the Welsh Government will be finalising the national measures, and I will report again to you on Monday with the full and final details. Finally today, I wanted to turn to one of the most important actions we can take, and this is for us all to follow the advice of the NHS Wales Test, Trace, Protect service if we are asked to self-isolate. We will be introducing 2 new schemes to support people on low incomes when they are asked to self-isolate. For some people, being asked to stay at home for 2 weeks can mean struggling to put food on the table because statutory sick pay is not a substitute for a week's wages. The 2 schemes we're announcing today will give people the financial security they need to stay at home when it is most important for them to do so. Because of the vital work they carry out on our behalf, we will provide a top-up to statutory sick pay for all social care staff, including personal assistants. They will receive their full wage if they have to take time off work because they have coronavirus or because they have been asked to self-isolate. And beyond that, there will be a £500 self-isolation support payment for people on low incomes in Wales. This will be available to help people to stay at home after a positive test or if they have been told to self-isolate by the contact tracing team. And as well as those measures, we will strengthen the regulations. We will introduce a new offence of knowingly giving false information to our TTP service, a new legal duty to self-isolate, and a duty on employers to ensure that they do not attempt to prevent an employee from following the advice to self-isolate. We are living through a period in which we are all being asked to do some of the hardest things that we need to do together. But all of that is so important if we are going to make a difference to the course of this deadly virus. We are all making sacrifices. We are all having to make changes to our lives. Once again, I thank all those people in every part of Wales who do so much and work so hard to make sure that they can play their part. It is through your help that we are able to face up to this challenge, because it is together that we can keep Wales safe. It is together that we can save lives here in Wales. Diolch o galon I chi gyd. I'll turn now, as usual, to take some questions from journalists, and all the answers will be broadcast live as ever on our own social media channels. First of all, today, over to Adrian Masters at ITV Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. I'd like to ask you about help and support for businesses, if I can. Furlough's coming to an end, as you know, and there's a gap, which you've spoken about before, the UK, or there has been a gap before the UK scheme kicked in. But businesses face a bewildering set of options here in Wales, not just the UK schemes, but Welsh Government schemes, your top-ups to try to meet some of the issues. And now the Economic Resilience Fund, the development grant. If I've got the jargon incorrect, I apologise, but I think it's the Economic Resilience Fund 3 development grant has been suspended. You can understand why some businesses will be confused and distressed, and it could even overwhelm them. What advice and what support and what reassurances can you offer?
Well, Adrian, of course I understand that when we make schemes available in Wales over and above the schemes available through the UK government, that does add complexity. But truthfully, I think it is a complexity that business understands and welcome, because with that complexity comes £500 million and more of help to businesses in Wales that would not be available to them at all if we were simply relying on the support that has come through the UK government. And as I always say, we recognise the scale and significance of that support. But we have put together £500 million of our own money here in Wales to make sure that the gaps in the UK government schemes can be filled, and that we can offer help to those parts of our economy that otherwise would not go assisted. And I'm afraid complexity is a bit of the price that comes with that, because people do have to be able to work with both systems. We've had a very large response already to phase 3 of the Economic Resilience Fund. And that tells me that there are thousands of businesses in Wales who want to get the help that we are making available to them. And help is available through the Business Wales website for people who aren't quite sure where in this complex landscape to go for help. But as I say, literally thousands of businesses have found their way to the schemes that we have on offer here in Wales. And I know from my contacts with people in the business community that the help the Welsh Government has provided is very much appreciated.
You've set out that today that what follows the firebreak will be nationwide. There'll be nationwide measures. I realise that you've been asked versions of this question before, but I will ask again. Does it mean that the local restrictions, the local lockdowns didn't work or didn't work well enough? And if they did work, why not return to them after November the 9th?
Well, I think you got the answer in the question, Adrian. It's not that they didn't work. It's that they didn't work well enough to withstand the onslaught that we have seen from this virus over the last 6 weeks. They undoubtedly have helped, and all the efforts that people have made in those areas have kept the virus at a lower level in Wales than would otherwise have been the case, and those efforts have absolutely been worthwhile. But the efforts have met a virus that has risen at a pace and on a scale that means that local measures are no longer sufficient to be able to deal with it. It's why we've got this 2-week fire break. Now, we've used the time to review the approach that we were taking earlier in the autumn. And while that approach has undoubtedly helped, it has come with some complexity of its own, with different rules in different parts of Wales and introduced at different times. For the sake of clarity and simplicity, our decision is that the other side of the fire break period, from the 9th of November, we will have a set of national rules that will apply in all parts of Wales. And I hope that that will help people in Wales just to be clearer about what they are being asked to do, because we have had evidence of people wanting to do the right thing, but not always being certain what the right thing is, because the rules have been more difficult to follow than we would have liked. We're going to simplify, we're going to clarify, and we're going to have a national scheme as from the 9th of November. Adrian, thank you very much. Over to James Williams at BBC Wales.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Can I get the answers in English and in Welsh, please? Can I start with another important issue before moving on to your announcements today? You were the only member of the Welsh Government's cabinet at the time to back Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. In fact, you made a virtue of it in your leadership pitch in 2018. Given where we are now, on reflection, do you think it was the right thing to align yourself so closely politically to Jeremy Corbyn? And on balance, do you think it was the right decision for the Labour Party to suspend Jeremy Corbyn yesterday?
Well, James, I welcome the publication of the report yesterday. Anti-Semitism is a stain on any society, and it has been a stain on the reputation of the Labour Party. I have been asked many times since I became the leader of the Labour Party in Wales of my own attitude to it, and I've tried to make it as clear as I possibly can that anti-Semitism has no place at all in the Labour Party or in Welsh society. And the report that was published yesterday made no references at all to Wales. And I'm glad of that, while wanting to make sure that the lessons of that report are applied right across the party to which I belong. I'm not going to answer questions in relation to individuals. The report itself, on page 49, criticises the previous leadership for, as they said, interfering or attempting to influence formal procedures, and it says it is not legitimate for the leadership to influence formal complaints procedures. There is a formal process in train, and I am not going to comment on it because the report, which I have welcomed, expressly tells me not to. Personally, I have always, since I joined the Labour Party at the age of 18, belonged to that great Welsh radical tradition in my party, the tradition of Aneurin Bevan, of Michael Foot, and indeed of the Clear Red Water agenda that I helped to shape with Rhodri Morgan nearly 20 years ago. The policy platform that the Labour Party stood on in the 2017 and the 2019 general election is a policy platform that I strongly supported, and I have no regrets about that. Just i ddweud, croesawais I ar y droddiad oedd yn cael ei cyhoeddi ddoe. Mae'r adroddiad yn gyfeirio jyst unwaith I Gymru pan mae'n ddweud, mae'n ganolbwyntio ar pethau sydd yn y dwylo pobl am Plaid Llafur yn Llundain yn nid yma yng Nghymru. Ond y cynnwys ar y adroddiad yn pwysig I ni gyd, a dwi wedi ddweud hynny bob tro mae pobl wedi ofyn cwestiynau I fi am anti-Semitism. Does dim lle o gwbl am Plaid Llafur neu yng Nghymru I gyd i'r bobl sy'n defnyddio termau neu gyda agweddau oeddwn ni wedi weld yn yr adroddiad, a dwi'n cefnogi a pethau mae Keir Starmer fel arweinydd Plaid Llafur yn dweud ddoe. Ar ochr unigolion, dwi ddim yn mynd i ddweud dim byd ar unigolion. Mae'r adroddiad yn glir. Dydy hwnna ddim y ffordd gorau i delio gyda'r pethau pan mae'r prosesau wedi ddechrau, a mae'n dweud hwnna yn glir yn yr adroddiad. Jyst i bod yn glir am pethau personol, dwi wedi bod rhan o'r traddodiad yn Plaid Llafur yma yng Nghymru, y traddodiad yn Erin Bevan, y traddodiad Michael Foot ac y traddodiad oeddwn ni'n gweithio gyda Rodri Morgan yno, nôl nawr byti 2 degawd yn ôl. Yr manifesto da ni yn Plaid Llafur nôl yn 2017 a 2019 oedd y cynnwys a manifesto oedd rhywbeth oedd ni'n teimlo'n gryf amdano ac yn eisiau cefnogi, a dwi'n dal i credu yn y pethau oeddwn ni'n awgrymu yn y dogfennau hwnna.
But as you said at the start of the answer, the report is about the UK Labour leadership, not the Welsh Labour leadership. So when they say that leadership shouldn't get involved, it's not referencing you. So was Nia Griffith, for example, was she wrong to say that she supported the decision this morning? Can I move on as well to talk about the duties that you're placing on people who need to self-isolate? Can you tell us exactly what that means? Are you going to be fining people if they do not self-isolate, or if they do not knowingly give the wrong information to contact tracers? Will you also be fining employers if they don't facilitate self-isolation? Is the £500 payment subject to tax as the £500 care bonus was as well? And why has it taken so long to get you? Because you announced this back in September.
Well, James, let me try and unravel some of those many questions. In relation to penalties, what I want to put in place is a mixture of positive inducements for people to do the right thing. And I think that almost everybody does want to do the right thing, and some people feel obstacles in their way because they have choices to make if they don't have sufficient income to meet their daily outgoings. That's why we want to put the extra help in place for social care workers, and that's why we want to put the £500 payment in place for people who are asked to self-isolate by our TTP system. You have to have some checks and balances in there though. If there is £500 available to you through self-isolating, then there is the risk that there is some fraud in the system. And so we have to take measures to prevent people from making false declarations simply in order to get hold of the money. And we also have to have some protections against employers who try and pressurize people to come into work after they've been asked to self-isolate by the system. That is the identical system that they have across our border in England. And we will be working over this weekend in finalising the actual levels of fixed penalty notices that we want to apply across a range of offences which we have had to create during the coronavirus period. I want to make sure that we have a moment to stand back, look at all of that, make sure that it is coherent, make sure that the level of penalties that we are proposing are proportionate and that they do the job we want them to do. But the real emphasis here has to be not on the stick but on the carrot. What we want people to do is the right thing. Almost everybody wants to do the right thing, and as a result of these announcements it will be easier to do the right thing here in Wales. James, diolch yn fawr. Over to Andy Davis at Channel 4.
Thank you, First Minister. You've said that bars, cafes and restaurants will reopen. For those businesses involved, can you confirm that that will be on the same basis as before the fire break? And can you give us an indication at this point of what sort of discussions you're having about travel and about meeting up with other people? What are the options currently being considered?
Andy, thank you. So your first question I can answer very straightforwardly. It will be on the same basis as those businesses traded before the 23rd of October. So we will be returning to the regime that was in place prior to the fire break. You've identified two of the most challenging issues to think through, and the Cabinet will continue to think through options that we have been exploring both on travel and on household mixing. On travel, the dilemmas that we have to think about are whether it is still sensible, when the virus has spread so far in Wales, to continue to ask people only to travel within their local authority. The case for it was strong to begin with because it prevented people taking the virus with them elsewhere. Is that still a proportionate thing to ask people to do when the virus is now in almost every part of Wales? That's the dilemma and the debate we will conclude this weekend. And in relation to household gathering, we know that most spread of coronavirus comes through human contact, and that the most human contact is taking place inside people's own homes. Can we devise a set of rules that people will abide by, that will bear down on the virus but still makes life livable? And in particular, can we devise a set of rules that reflect the way in which young people in our society live their lives? We've had, as you know, the system of a different number of households being able to form an extended household and then move in and out of one another's houses. That is particularly unlikely to match the way in which young people live their lives, who want to meet other young people rather than other households. And we're grappling with those dilemmas. I had a very good opportunity in this week to meet a group of young people brought together by children in Wales. What they said to me is they want to follow the rules, but they need a set of rules that works with the grain of the way in which they live their lives. And the Cabinet here will be working hard to try to find a way through that very knotty dilemma, and we'll conclude it this weekend, and I will be here on Monday to let people know the outcome.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier the number of people in hospitals in Wales who've developed coronavirus. Do you know what proportion of those cases acquired the infection whilst in hospital? And is that something that you are actively looking at the moment?
Yes, absolutely. It's being looked at very actively. I don't have a Wales-wide figure, and it does vary a lot between one setting and another. Once coronavirus is in any closed setting, particularly where there are vulnerable people who are already unwell, then the virus can be very virulent indeed. Our staff in our hospitals work so hard to try to make sure that all infection control procedures are properly in place and being implemented all the time. But we have learnt new things. You'll remember, Andy, that there was an outbreak in the Myla Hospital in Wrexham earlier in end of the summer, beginning of the autumn, which was successfully brought back under control. And some of the techniques that they used there and some of the learning that they've taken from that experience is being shared right across the Welsh health system to try and make sure that we have all the protections we can in place, while not being able to say to anybody that when you have that number of people coming through the door already ill with coronavirus, that no matter how scrupulously people observe all the rules and no matter how hard people work to prevent the infection being passed from one person to another, you cannot guarantee that will never take place. Andy, thank you very much. I'll go to Dan Bevan at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon. Across Europe, many governments are now coming to the consensus that a second lockdown is either needed or certainly needs to be considered. Of course, we're very much in the middle of one here in Wales. But across the border, the UK government have once again said they're trying to avoid that outcome. Do you think that the fire break here is at the mercy of what goes on over the border?
No, I don't think it is. Dan, all the powers, all the decisions that need to be made are made here in Wales and are made by people who are responsible for the conduct of the health service and other aspects of our defence against coronavirus. Part of that, as you know, is that people from Tier 2 and Tier 3 areas in England are not able to visit Wales. So we have built a defence against the transmission of the virus across the border from those parts of England where the virus is in the greatest circulation. The position in England is different, and we've got to, I think, have some understanding. You know, we have 22 local authorities. They literally have hundreds. The gap between the part of England where the virus is at its least and the part of England where it is at its height is far greater than we see here in Wales. And my job is to make the right decisions for Wales, and I don't want people to read criticism of others off the back of the decisions that we think are right for us.
Thank you. And earlier today you talked about statistics. I've got a few here from Ofcom, who surveyed people in Wales. They found from the people that responded that 37% of people say that they are concerned about misinformation about coronavirus, and 52% say they don't feel confident in understanding the figures of deaths and cases. Do you feel like the fight against coronavirus is just as important as the fight against disinformation on coronavirus?
Well, Dan, thank you very much. That's a really important question. One of the big differences, I think, between this part of the year and earlier in the year is that some people have made it their business to try to mislead people about coronavirus, to spread, I think, pernicious lies about it. Those things that you see where people pretend that coronavirus isn't a real thing, pretend that it is just a mild illness that does nobody any harm, and wants to somehow persuade people that all of this is just some sort of sham. Now, when people hear things like that, I understand why people feel they must pause for thought. But what I do want to say to people is that all of that is a cruel and deliberate deception. None of that will resonate in the minds of the 60 families who have lost somebody in just this 1 week. And we will continue as a Welsh Government to put out information which is as reliable, as up-to-date and as informative as we can. We'll do it here in this way week after week, and we will try to make sure that people who need sources of information which they can rely upon get that through the Welsh Government and through the Welsh NHS and other sources that you can trust here in Wales. And I just urge people not to be misled, not to think that people who peddle these stories that are so far from the truth have anything to offer you or the rest of us here in Wales. Dan, thanks very much for the chance to put all of that on record. I'll go to Will Haywood now at Wales Online.
Thank you very much, First Minister. This leads on from Dan's first question. How much is the state of the virus in England playing into your thinking about the measures that will be introduced here in Wales when the fire breaks ends? You've said that you believe in a four-nation approach, particularly around Christmas, but if the fire break works and brings the R rate under control in Wales, yet cases in England still remain on their current trajectory, could having people from Wales mixing with family and friends across the border pose an additional risk to transmission here in Wales?
Well, thank you, Will, and that is an additional dilemma for us, of course. I hope, as anybody sensible would hope, that the measures that are being taken in England help to bring the virus under control there, help to save lives there too. And that's what, that I've got no interest at all in turning this into a competition between Wales and any other part of the United Kingdom. I wish everybody in every part of the United Kingdom who are working hard to deal with this virus and to bring it under control, I have nothing but a positive wish to see those things succeed. But what I do want to see is an opportunity to discuss these matters with the UK government. The Prime Minister wrote to me at the start of this week and said that I would be receiving an invitation from Michael Gove to a discussion on a common approach to Christmas across the United Kingdom. We've done our best to try to secure that meeting this week. It hasn't yet been forthcoming. We need to get round the table together. We need to share that information. We need to share ideas. And wherever we can, particularly around that Christmas period, I would like to see as common an approach as we can craft together, while recognising that the state of the virus and the response that's being made does differ from one part of the UK to another.
Thank you. The first local lockdown in Wales came into effect in Caerphilly on September the 8th, with other areas following shortly afterwards. People in those areas who have followed the rules will, by the end of the firebreak period, have spent more than 2 months not able to leave their county without a reasonable excuse. I know you're not going to go into too much detail about what you're announcing on Monday, but can you at least guarantee to these people that they will be able to leave their counties after November the 9th? And if you could also give us the latest R rate for Wales, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you very much indeed. The latest R rate for Wales is the one that I saw last week, which put us somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 on the R scale. The R is made up of about 7 different research efforts that are then pulled together and come out with a common number. It will change. You know, it changes every week, but that was the latest one that I have seen myself. On the issue of travel and people being confined to their county boundaries, I'm not going to be able to anticipate what I will say on Monday, other than to say that we are acutely aware of the restriction that that places on people's lives, that in some ways it is an unfair restriction because it has a different impact depending on the size of the local authority you happen to live in. And the smaller the local authority, the greater the impact that has on your life. So all of that is playing a very important part in the thinking that we have been going through this week and will conclude over the weekend. And the points, Will, that you make, are being very actively rehearsed as we try to find a new solution to the issue of travel. Thank you very much. Over to Adam Hale at PA.
Diolch i ti, Prif Weinidog. The UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab has suggested today that if England's tiered restrictions aren't enough to curb coronavirus, then the country there could introduce a French-style lockdown instead. Those measures, which come into force at midnight in France today, appear to be pretty close to what we currently have here in Wales. I'm wondering if you believe there's any reason at all why Mr. Raab seems to be oblivious to what's happening just 3 hours down the road from Westminster, or whether there's a lack of desire in England to acknowledge that it could in fact be replicated in Wales's measures.
Well, Adam, it's often a bit of a puzzle to me why some of our colleagues in London, and that's not just politicians, but it's people who broadcast and write in London, look across the channel to France and Germany and Italy and rehearse everything that's happening there and don't appear to be interested to rehearse what is happening inside the United Kingdom itself, both what we are doing in Wales, but the measures that they are taking in Northern Ireland, which have been in place longer than ours, and the measures that are being taken in the central belt of Scotland. So I think I'm sorry if I sound a bit like a stuck record on this, but the reason why I always say that we need to have a better regularity of coming together around that table is that would be an opportunity for UK ministers to make sure that they are properly informed about the measures that are being taken, their success or otherwise in different parts of the United Kingdom. We would all learn better from that. I'm interested in what happens in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world as well. And we're lucky that Public Health Wales here is an organisation with a very good international reach and reputation. But you probably learn the most for those who are closest to you. And I've always thought that there is more that we could have done to learn those lessons together.
Yeah, and on the decisions made so far for this lockdown, restricting the sale of non-essential items appears somewhat to have misjudged the public mood. We've heard, obviously, that it was people talking to others indoors, in homes, pubs and restaurants. That was the main cause of the surge in virus in here in Wales. Given that, and given what you've learned from this period, do you envisage that future short lockdowns in Wales will look like the one that we're experiencing right now, or is there scope for different rules for shopping, exemptions for places like gyms and places of worship and so on?
Well, if we were, and it's a big if, isn't it? If we were to need to have a further period of the sort that we have just had, a fire break period, then I think it would be absolutely incumbent on us to learn the lessons of these 2 weeks, to think about what has worked well, what has made the most contribution to our combined ambition to drive that R number down as low as we can get it, and to look at the things that made less of a contribution to it and which could be done differently another time. What we were powerfully advised for this period was that if you wanted to make the fire break short, then you needed to make it sharp. And that's why we've had the depth of restrictions that we have on people, so that we can get through it in just 2 weeks and then allow businesses and people's lives to resume closer to how they have been before the fire break was instituted. But learning the lessons and thinking ahead, should we need to do something similar, well, any sensible government and any sensible person would want to do that. Adam, diolch yn fawr. Over to Steve Bagnall at the Daily Post.
Thank you, First Minister. I appreciate you have already touched on this. If the new rules regime following the fire break allows for greater travel than currently allowed, what is the Welsh Government considering about cross-border travel with England if rates are still rising there? Will the bans remain in place? Will it apply both ways? And will this form part of Monday's announcement?
Thank you, Stephen. I understand just how important those cross-border issues are to readers of the Daily Post along the northeast part of Wales. People are still, even now, able to travel across the border for important purposes like going to work or attending medical appointments and so on. So that will definitely continue beyond the 9th of November. I will want to study over this weekend and into next week the comparative incidence rates between Wales and parts of England which are under Tier 2 and Tier 3 restrictions. The point of asking people in those places not to travel into Wales was because the rate of virus circulation in those places was so much more than it is here, and I'm afraid there is still a significant gap between those places and Wales. And if that remains the same, then we will expect to have a similar regime after the 9th of November as we had prior to the 23rd of October, because it just doesn't make sense to add to the difficulties we already face by the virus being imported from elsewhere.
Thank you, First Minister. And vaccines have been in the news again recently. Will the Welsh Government have any autonomy to buy vaccines and decide who gets them themselves, or is there extra staff and logistics in place for this? Or will Wales have to follow the UK Government and how it distributes them?
No, the ability to distribute vaccines and the priorities that we will have and the practical delivery of vaccines on the ground is something that we will have to organise here in Wales, and there's already a great deal of thought and planning gone into that earlier in the year. The purchase of vaccine, it will be to our advantage to be part of a UK purchasing arrangement. You can imagine, Steve, that when a vaccine does become available that is effective, that vaccine will be wanted in every part of the world. And your ability to argue for supplies to come to Wales will undoubtedly be better if we are part of a UK-wide approach to securing that vaccine. And that's what we've been up until now, and that's what I hope we will be when the day comes that a vaccine that is effective is available to us. Over to Rupert Evelyn at ITN.
Thank you, First Minister. Can I just ask a question about the next couple of days? It is Halloween. That comes in a different shape and form under different restrictions, obviously. would you encourage people, if they stick to the rules that they have to stick to go out and just enjoy a walk around their neighbourhood this weekend and take in some of the hard work that's been put together by many of the families over Halloween, without obviously knocking on people's doors, etc.?
Well, I've been absolutely struck myself by the imagination that some families have shown in finding a way to mark Halloween by having displays in their gardens and so on. And, you know, taking exercise is a legitimate thing to do even in the fire break period, and where people are walking around, then I think it is a real opportunity to admire the ingenuity, the imagination, the creativity that many people have put into finding a different way of celebrating Halloween. We can't do it in the way that people are used to, but people are showing that that doesn't mean that you can't do it at all.
All right. And my second question, just really on your post-fire break plans for a national set of guidelines, does that not in some way impact those who are in the areas of low COVID incidence, and they are having to pay a price for those who are in a higher area of COVID cases?
Well, yes, that's an inevitable trade-off. The truth is, though, that parts of Wales that have low incidence have been reducing rapidly over the last few weeks. It's only Pembrokeshire really today that has an incidence below the threshold we used originally to put Caerphilly, for example, into a local set of lockdown measures. So a national set of measures is inevitably a blunt instrument, and there will be parts of Wales where it will be a bigger ask of people than it has been up until now. But for the sake of simplicity and clarity, and helping people to know what the right thing is to do, and given the fact that the gap between different parts of Wales is not what it was even 6 weeks or a month ago, that is the direction we think makes the greatest sense for the greatest number of people. Rupert, thank you very much. To Rob Taylor at Wrexham.com.
Ahead of Monday's announcement, it appears there's been discussion this week towards more of an emphasis on personal responsibility, and you've touched on that early today. Considering cases are still up in many local authority areas and some have been in local lockdown well before the fire break, why do you feel that people who have not taken such personal responsibility lately will now do so? And earlier you also mentioned about strengthening rules about work from home. What would that entail?
Thanks very much, Rob. Well, on your first point, I think the advice we are getting, particularly from the sort of behavioural scientists, is that if you just emphasise the rules, then those people who are willing to abide by them and keen to abide by them put a lot of emphasis on that and try to do their very best. But there are quite a lot of people in Wales for whom the rules have become too complicated, or it's just gone on too long, and they just no longer feel they have a real grasp of what it is they should and shouldn't do. And that if we are going to get to a position where everybody is making their contribution, we have to move away from a constant emphasis on rules, and therefore the long conversations we have about whether this is allowed or that is allowed, and if that can happen, why can't this happen? And just say to people, the real question is not what do the rules allow, but what should I do? What is the contribution that I can make in what is a national emergency, and an emergency that has been accelerating away from us in recent weeks to the point where it will form a real threat to our ability to carry on doing all the things that people quite rightly expect our health service to do. So it is, it is a message to people to use the rules as a backstop, not as the first way in which you navigate your decision making. The fewer people you meet, the fewer journeys you make, the safer you will be and the safer your family will be. If you're needing to meet somebody or you're thinking of making a journey, ask yourself that question. Is that necessary? Do I have to do this? And sometimes the answer to that will undoubtedly be yes. But if the answer is no, then the answer to the question, what should I do, is don't do it. Because by doing it, you add to the risk. And every little bit of risk adds up, and all those risks end up with people in there, now well over 1,000 people in hospital here in Wales today. That's why I'm so keen today to emphasise that message.
Thank you. And this week you've written to an opposition MS regarding the contents of a tweet. The week before, a widely shared and still active tweet was mentioned in Parliament by Alan Davis MS regarding a straight lie about bed use in hospital. Has a letter been written to that author and publisher on that one, or any other similar disinformation social media posts, or was this letter this week just a one-off?
Well, I'm afraid it's impossible for the Welsh Government to chase after every bit of erroneous information that is put into the public domain. I wrote this week because the disinformation was put out by what would normally be thought of as a credible source, an official spokesperson on health matters. And I thought that that gave what was said an additional level of credibility, which I'm afraid the content very much did not deserve. Because of that reason, I thought it was important to write. But given, as we've heard in earlier questions, the volume of traffic that there is on social media and the number of times that people say things that you know simply not to be true, it would be an impossible task for the Welsh Government to try and pursue every one of them. Rob, thank you very much indeed. Finally today to Nathan Shoesmith at the Speaker.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon. Can you confirm how the new measures you've announced today work with the NHS COVID-19 app? Due to changes with the app, more people will be asked to isolate by the app. Will people on low incomes who are asked to self-isolate by the app be eligible for the £500 payment you've announced, unlike in England? If not, why not? And will the duty introduced on employers also cover people self-isolating under the advice of the app?
Well, Nathan, I probably don't have in front of me some of the detailed part of that question, but we'll make sure we can get it to you. In general, the point is this, that for us in Wales, the app is an additional extra to our TTP system, not a substitute for it. We've been keen to support the development of the app to make sure that it is as useful as possible, but it is as well as, not instead of, our own TTP system. I know that there were some announcements yesterday about changing some of the calibrations in the app that will lead to more people getting advice through it, and we will need just to make sure that we've worked through the changes in the app's levels of alert to the way in which our TTP system works. But I don't have that detail in front of me this morning.
Thank you. And you've repeatedly said how after the fire break period ends, everything will be reopening. Do you feel that opening everything at once could risk the virus spreading due to the small minority that you mentioned earlier acting as if the virus isn't there when it actually is? Do you fear that could be a problem?
I think that is a very realistic anxiety. We said to people in Wales that we would ask everyone to make this extraordinary national effort over a 2-week period to produce a fire break, and that's what we are doing. We are, as you said, reopening large parts of Welsh life to return it to where it was before the 23rd of October. Does that bring risks with it? It certainly does. How do we mitigate those risks? By asking people, as I have today, to think very carefully indeed about how they conduct their own lives, how we, each of us, make those decisions. The fewer people we meet, the fewer journeys we make, after the 9th of November, the safer we all will be. And people have to, I think, be able to think that through in their own circumstances, to think about the responsibility that they have to themselves, to their families, to other people that they know and meet. And if we all do that, then that risk can be mitigated. If people don't, then there is always the possibility that everything we have gained in this 2 weeks will come under pressure again. But it can be avoided, and it can be avoided by people acting in the ways that we've been talking about today. Thank you very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr.